Photography on the Lofoten in winter can be challenging. Out of the 7 days we spent traveling northern Norway, on 4 of those we got blasted by freezing wind, heavy snow and icy rain. Nonetheless, we had a route to follow, and with this video I want to share a few highlights and locations. After 3 different flights, we finally arrived in Tromsø. The city has a few photographic gems, but we decided to get some proper rest and just stroll through those tiny shopping streets instead. Day 1 started with a 4-hour drive to SENJA, the second largest island of Norway. We had a 1-day stopover here in a small village called Fjord to check out a few promising spots. The very first spot we wanted to check out was the Tungeneset viewpoint. Following Road 862, you will pass a small parking lot right next to it, and it doesn't even take 5 minutes to walk to the viewpoint. Here you got sharp mountains in the distance with waves crashing over the rocky coastline. It's easy to find something interesting for the foreground while the background is filled by the mountains. Of course, a wide-angle lens is recommended to capture the whole scenery. As I wanted to include the crashing waves, I played around with shutter speeds of around half a second or shorter to get some motion blur but still have some structure in the waves. A little further down Road 862 there is another vantage point right next to the road. This time we're overlooking a small fjord. Using a wide-angle lens here will help you to get the road below the vantage point in the frame as well. During the sunset we had gorgeous light as the sun was hitting the mountains on the right side of the fjord. As the sun was about to vanish behind the horizon, we headed back to Fjord. The aurora forecast for the night was looking very promising, so we put on some more layers of clothes and headed out in the dark. Although the village was producing enough light pollution to not be able to see any stars, walking just a few hundred meters outside of it revealed a beautiful dark sky with the most intense northern lights we ever saw. As I wanted to get as much of the northern lights as possible in the image while still having a bit of landscape in the foreground, I used my widest lens. You might think you need to crank up the exposure for those shots, but those lights are actually moving pretty quickly across the sky, which results in motion blur. So to get clean shots, I tried to use shutter speeds of around 10 seconds and instead just relied on a high ISO and a wide open aperture. The next day was a travel day. This means going from SENJA to the Lofoten Islands. Originally, the plan was to take a big shortcut and use a car ferry. Unfortunately, the plan was a little unorganized, so we missed the ferry. Instead, we had to take the long way, which meant driving about 9 hours all the way down to Hamnoy. Along the way there are great photo opportunities. Sadly, in the winter however, it's almost impossible to stop next to the road due to all the snow, and parking spaces are rare to find. But every now and then we found a spot to stop for a quick photo shoot. If you're staying on the Lofoten, Hamnoy is the perfect place for your base camp. Right there in Hamnoy you can find one of the most iconic photo spots, but just a short drive outside the small village, no matter in which direction, will lead you to plenty of famous photo spots like Reine or the Fjord. The village itself is densely packed with red fishing huts. While they look really good on photo, I can also highly recommend staying in one of those, since they are very cozy and relatively cheap. On our first day here, the weather was perfect, with a few puffy clouds in the sky. The first thing to do was to catch the sunrise from the bridge in Hamnoy, while the mountain face in the back gets lit up by the sunlight. For this spot you want a wide angle lens. I first tried 24mm but soon switched to 60mm to get some sky above the mountains while still being able to see the waves below. For this scene the usual shutter speed would be rather fast to get details in the waves below, but I also wanted to shoot a few longer exposures to capture all the movement that's going on here. From this spot you get a classic Lofoten image, but of course you won't be the only person here, so be prepared for a lot of people. Alternatively, you can go a little further across the road on top of a small hill to get a different view of the situation. As the day continued, more and more clouds rolled in. So I hope I will pronounce it right, probably not, but to not miss any good spots we drove to A. A is another tiny village literally at the end of the Lofoten. Before our trip I found a few very promising places, but what looked great in summer was basically unreachable for us in the winter due to all the snow. So instead of hiking we just explored the surrounding areas a bit. On the drive back from R to Hamnoy, there were some more unplanned stops. Right outside of R is another great spot with rough mountains in the back and the fishing village below them. For the foreground I tried to capture the waves again, but sadly I wasn't able to get close enough. Another highlight, for which I was most excited about, was the village of Reine, right before Hamnoy. This is another classic view, but I wanted to capture the scene in winter myself. At this point the weather was still okay and we had some light left, but without the mountains in the back getting hit by the sunset. The scene is quite wide. I first gave my 24mm lens a try, but quickly switched to 16mm to truly capture everything. As the conditions were far from perfect, I had hoped to give it another try the following days. Well, by the next day the sky was covered in clouds and it started snowing. At first it wasn't too bad, so we decided to drive around for a bit and maybe check out the Fjord. On the way there we passed two bridges which people often like to include in their Lofoten videos, and since I recently just got a drone, of course I want to try my hands on that as well. Thanks to the elevated viewpoint I got with the drone, we spotted a very interesting mountain range in the distance. Since we still had a lot of daylight left, we decided to drive in that direction and get a bit closer. But as we approached the mountains, the weather started to get really bad. Once we didn't see them in the distance anymore, we turned around heading straight to the Fjord before losing our chances at some proper shots there as well. Sadly, with every minute it got worse, to a point where the road right in front of us was almost invisible. So our last stop for the day was the Skagsanten beach. Usually a beautiful beach with proper waves for surfing. Now only a few people tried to withstand the harsh winds. This was the weather for the following days, so we just sat there in our little hut, checked the weather every few minutes and hoped for the best. Unfortunately, things didn't really change and we had to make our way back to Tromsø. However, there was one more highlight we were totally excited about: the Polar Park. The world's most northernmost animal park. Although it was still snowing like crazy, it was a pleasant walk through the park and we were able to see a bunch of different animals. This was one of the rare occasions I photographed wildlife, but I was pretty satisfied with the results. At first I tried photographing the animals from the tripod, but soon realized I was too immobile this way. Cranking up the ISO and aperture helped me getting sharp images even on longer focal lengths, which are required to properly frame the subject here. The perfect ending for an exciting photo vacation.